Hi, welcome to Grafted, Jewish Roots of Christianity. I'm your host, Stephanie Pavlantos. Today, I have David Wilber with me. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's an honor to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, David is a writer and a teacher, a Bible teacher as well, an apologist and a speaker. I've read that you speak at different churches and denominations. You're also the CEO of a shared publishing company called Pronomian, right?
Yeah,
Say it kind of
Pronomian Publishing.
okay. There we go. So yeah, I knew I was gonna mess that up, but I appreciate it, and I look forward to our conversation. We kind of just left it up to the Holy Spirit. We're going to talk about some of your books and your testimony because you are a Messianic believer, which
Mm,
means you keep the feast, you worship on Shabbat, the seventh day, Saturday,
mm.
and you're an apologist. So you've written lots of great articles. I've read some of them here and there. You're on Facebook. You have a YouTube channel, I believe.
Mhm.
So you're doing lots and lots of different things. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks again for having me on. Yeah, so my journey, I guess, started well, first of all, I grew up in a Lutheran church. That was the church that my family brought me to and where I was raised. But in high school was when I really began to know the Lord in a deeper way. When I came to really understand the gospel and
Mm.
to be born again. And so that happened at a Baptist youth group that a friend invited me to. And yeah, I was very involved in that youth group all throughout high school. And after high school, I kind of didn't really have a home after that. The church that I was at actually ended up dissolving, the Baptist church. And so I didn't really have a church home after that. I was doing a lot of searching. I've always been interested in theology and apologetics. And one day I got in touch with someone who went to my old Baptist church, someone that I really looked up to, and he was really into theology and apologetics as well. And he was running a Bible study at his home, and he invited me to the Bible study. And turns out that he had been into Messianic theology for the past few years. And he was teaching a lot of these ideas at the Bible study, these ideas about the Jewish roots of Christianity and
Mm-hmm.
the Sabbath and the festivals and how they all point to the Messiah. And so this is my first time really hearing a lot of this at this Bible study. I was blown away. Like I said, I've always been interested in theology, and I've always had questions about things like the Sabbath, for instance. Like it's one of the 10 commandments, and it was weird to me, that Christians didn't keep it. We look at the Jewish people, and the Jewish people, they observe the Sabbath on the seventh day from Friday night to
Mm-hmm.
Saturday night. Christians go to church on Sunday. And so Christians going to church on Sunday, that's not the same thing as the Sabbath. So what about this whole Sabbath thing? Like I said, it's one of the 10 commandments. It seems pretty important. But I've always just kind of put that on the shelf because my the church that I was attending didn't teach it. And none of the other Christians that I knew really talked about it. And so I'm like, okay, that's kind of strange, but it was always something that kind of stuck with me in
Mm-hmm.
my brain. And so the first time hearing at this Bible study, the first time hearing this notion that actually the Sabbath is for us today, it is for Christians today, that just caused everything in my brain to click. It just made so much sense.
Yeah.
The Old Testament and the New Testament, they were not opposed to each other. The New Testament did not replace the Old Testament or change it. Everything is consistent, and that it just really resonated with me. And so from there, I was like a sponge. I was soaking in everything that I could. I was getting into the word like never before. And I guess that I was around 20 years old when when I started attending the Bible study, and I'm 36 now.
Okay.
And so yeah, that was kind of the beginning of my journey into Messianic theology, the
Mm-hmm.
Jewish roots of Christianity, and investigating a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, from there, I you know I discovered that I had a teaching gift. I had a gift to kind of communicate this information in a
Right.
way that people can understand it and apply
Mm-hmm.
it. And some mentors that I had at the time and others were affirming that gift in me and encouraging me to walk in it. And it just kind of took off from there. I started writing. I started a blog. I got involved with 119 Ministries. I'm still
Mm-hmm.
part of 119 Ministries, and yeah, and then I started writing books, and so I've written 4 books now.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book on the biblical festivals, and so it's called a Christian Guide to the Biblical Feasts, and so it just goes through all of the biblical festivals, how they point to the Messiah, and
Right.
how they are relevant to Christians. I wrote a commentary on James. I wrote another book called Is God a Misogynist, where
Mm-hmm.
I counter a lot of the feminist objections to the Bible, feminist and atheist criticisms of particularly the Old Testament. And my latest book is on the Sabbath. It's called Remember the Sabbath, What the New Testament Says About Sabbath Observance for Christians. And that just goes through all of the relevant passages in the New Testament concerning the Sabbath. And I
Right.
argue that the New Testament does not do away with the Sabbath, that the Sabbath is still relevant for Christians. And I even go into early church history as well and look at how, in the first 5 centuries of
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, most Christians outside of Alexandria and Rome were continuing to observe the Sabbath. And so that is something that's the latest book I wrote. It's a topic I'm very interested in and
Mm-hmm.
passionate about. But yeah, now I'm in school. I'm graduating actually in a few weeks.
Well,
With
good.
my Yeah, thank you. With my bachelor's in biblical studies, I plan on going and getting my master's after that, and that's kind of where things are right now.
Well,
Oh,
nice.
I'm also married and have 2 kids. So yeah,
Good to
Aaliyah and
know. We don't
Ezra.
want to leave out
Yeah.
the spouse.
Yep.
I understand. I understand. I talk about my family a lot, often on the podcast. Just one thing or another comes up, but my dad was very strict about not necessarily keeping Saturday as a Sabbath, but to him, Sunday was a Sabbath because that's how we had grown up. That Sabbath was Sunday, but in his understanding, to keep it holy was to not work at all. We weren't allowed to do laundry. We weren't allowed to do any work around the house, any work outside. We were to rest. That was it. We were to rest and to attend the services from our church. So we went on Sunday morning, we went on Sunday evening, my entire childhood. And I remember just like, why are we the only ones that can't do our laundry on Sunday, And if we
Mm,
didn't get it done on Saturday, we just didn't do it because it was about keeping it holy. And
right.
I think
Yeah.
that's what even most Christians lose about the Sabbath is keeping it holy, because that is what
Mm,
the commandment says. I mean, whether you think it is on Sunday or Saturday, are you still keeping it holy and
right.
putting it as a day aside for the Lord? And so I think that even that is hard for most people. And so but anyway, so you have written a lot of articles, but I did read some reviews on your one of your books and really, really good reviews. And I think it was on
Thank
the
you.
one on what's the
Is God a
title? Is God?
misogynist?
Yes, yes, it was that one. And really good reviews. And so I was happy to see that because I like to read reviews. I'm an author. I've written
Mhm,
different
mhm.
articles and stuff. And reviews mean a lot. And so of course
Yes.
you're always gonna have I know that you get your share of criticism and, comments that happen on YouTube or Facebook or whatever. I like to read the comments when people bring up something that's a little controversial and see
Uh-huh.
how the majority of people are dealing with it. But a lot of times you get the same arguments over and over. And I think it's just such a lack of our understanding of scripture
Mhm.
And that's really why I even started the podcast, because I knew that the things I was learning throughout the last 15 years, many of the people I went to church with didn't quite get and didn't
Mhm.
quite understand. And so I thought, but you brought up another point, and you brought up about our church history.
Mhm.
It was a Messianic Jewish woman who taught me about my church history.
Hmm.
I didn't know. I didn't know how anti-Semitic our church fathers were.
Yeah.
And it was very shocking to me, because I've had pastors who talk about the church fathers and how amazing, or whatever they have to
Right,
say about
right.
them. It was not negative. Let's just put it that way. And so it was very eye-opening to start reading for myself,
Mhm.
that even with, I think Ignatius is the one who sticks out the most to me, and that he was a self-proclaimed anti-Semitic bishop of Antioch.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't think we know our church history, our church
Yeah, he
fathers.
yeah, I talk about Ignatius a little bit in my book, Remember the Sabbath.
Okay.
And yeah, he was definitely not a fan of Judaism. But
Mm.
yeah, and I mean there's a lot of you see even up going up to Martin Luther. I mean
Oh,
Martin
yeah.
Luther
Yeah.
was yeah, people would be shocked to see
Mhm.
what he wrote about the Jews.
And his anger, from what I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but was more so that the Jews had rejected his gospel
Mm,
preaching, and that's why then he turned around and rejected them.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, what I try to highlight in the book is actually there is definitely some divergence, between Jews and Christians, but also there was a lot of commonality. So a point that I like to bring up is that we have historical evidence of at least two fifth century church historians, Socrates, Scholasticus, and Sozomen, who write that as late as the 5th century, almost all the Christians outside of Alexandria and Rome still kept the Sabbath. And so it was really within Alexandria and Rome that you see Christians abandoning the Sabbath much earlier on.
right.
And it was in those regions where there was greater hostility toward the Jewish people.
Mhm.
And so that's I think that's kinda how where you see that trajectory start within Alexandria and Rome earlier
Mhm.
on. And then Constantine, when he issued his edict, to start treating Sunday as a day of rest. But before that time, nobody thought of Sunday as a day of rest. That you had Christians that observed Sunday in commemoration of the Messiah's resurrection, but many of them also observed the Sabbath, so they observed both of them, and so they did not think of Sunday as a replacement of the Sabbath,
Mm.
but they thought of it as a separate religious day. But
Right.
then Constantine issued his edict, and so those lines started to get blurry, and Sunday started being treated as the Sabbath. And that's where you get later on in history when you have certain Protestant, Puritans and other Protestant confessions and things like that. They affirm the Sabbath commandment, but they mean Sunday. And sounds like that was kind of your tradition growing up, is
Mm.
is that you treated Sunday as the Sabbath. So it's kind of interesting, that like I said, what I highlight in the book is more of like the commonalities and and the fact that Christianity was not monolithic. You
Mhm.
had many Christians that stayed attached to Judaism in various ways, and
Right.
they state that they had not entirely severed their Jewish roots, so to speak.
Yes. And I think it's very fascinating to go back and understand even the way, the first Nazarenes were actually a mixture, well, I guess they were probably a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. serving the Lord, and they found quite a few. I read a book about it. It was called The Ways of the Way, and it talked
Hmm.
about their what they did and how they brought people in, how different it was from church today as we know it, because we might invite someone to come to church with us and say, "Pastor, will you talk to my friend about Jesus and will you teach them?" And but it actually in this book said that you, as the friend, actually told the people about Jesus. You led them to the Messiah, and then when they had made that commitment and decided to follow Messiah and put all their faith in him and keep his commandments, then they went to the synagogue, or what we might call, you know, church, or whatever,
Right.
the assembly. Then that it was only then that they went. So it's interesting because we want to think of church as being for all people, which it is, but really back then it was only for the believers of Messiah.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
I found that really interesting. But
Yeah.
you also, in some of your articles, and one that I saw that you had posted today, was about Peter and Paul. And
Mhm.
we see in scripture, especially I believe in Galatians, where Paul has a bit of a problem with Peter. And then later on, Peter's kind of trying to explain things about Paul and talk about how he explains things and how he speaks and stuff like that. So, do you want to go there a little bit and kind of unpack a little bit of your article on that?
Yeah, sure. So the article that I wrote that I published today, it is on 2 Peter 3:15 through 17. And that is a passage where Peter issues a warning to his readers. And he warns that Paul's letters contain content that is hard to understand. And he goes on to say that the quote, ignorant and unstable people misinterpret Paul's
Mm,
letters. And then he goes on to connect this error of misinterpreting Paul's letters to quote unquote lawless people.
right.
And so what I try to bring out in this passage as I write this article, in the article, I basically argue that this passage is Peter's warning regarding antinomians. Antinomians were people who rejected God's law. The word literally means against law. And so they were antinomians who were misrepresenting passages in Paul's letters in order to advocate for lawlessness.
Mhm.
And it's just a fascinating passage. Peter he's talking about another apostle, and he's basically saying that yeah, these false teachers are misusing Paul's letters in order to argue for antinomianism. And it's fascinating if we think of this in our own time, that there are other people that kind of twist Paul's letters to make them say something that they don't. In particular, to make them say that we're free from the law, for
Mhm.
example.
Sorry, but yeah, even that
Yeah.
he converted. So
Mm.
stuff like that. But go ahead.
Right. Yeah. That was the message of these false teachers.
Mhm.
In the letter of Second Peter, Peter is going off on these false teachers, and basically saying that they deny the future coming of the Messiah. They deny the future judgment, and they target vulnerable believers and they lead them into
Mhm.
sexual immorality, and they blaspheme and they lie, and they reject the way of righteousness and the holy commandment, and all
Mhm.
of this. And so essentially they are antinomians, they are anti-law. And the point that Peter is making is that he associates the error of misinterpreting Paul with these false teachers who promote antinomianism. And so I think that's a fascinating connection,
Mhm.
especially in modern time. It seems that there are efforts today in various ways to kind of depict Paul or depict Paul's letters in ways that Paul did not intend. to present Paul's letters as him promoting antinomianism, promoting freedom from the law of God.
Mhm.
So I think Peter's warning is relevant for today,
Mhm.
and so that's what I kind of bring out in the passage.
And Paul's letters are difficult, which is why there is so much confusion about what they say. I mean, I had a friend say to me, "Well, Paul was totally against the law," and this was a few years ago, and I remember just thinking, I've never read that way, and I was it just kind of threw me because I'm like, how do you read that? And so and then I said, I mean, even how many people I've known that feel like Paul converted to
Mhm.
Christianity, and it's like Paul didn't have to convert. Paul was kept his Jewishness. He even talks about that he was, a Pharisee among the Pharisees. He was a tribe of Benjamin. I mean, he's really talking about his Jewishness, and at the same time, he is not converting to a new religion, but just saying, I know the Messiah. I know who he is, the promised Messiah. And I think we can all understand that's what he, of course, who he loved and who he served. His life changed in a major way. And I was telling this to a friend. I said I had heard another pastor talk about that you can't walk into a room or go tell your boss that, sorry, I'm late. I got hit by a Mack truck. And and your boss not like, "What? What do you mean you got hit by a Mack truck?" Your life would be very different. You wouldn't be standing here,
Right.
and he
You'd be in the
and he
hospital.
yeah, and he
Yeah.
basically said that that's what our life in Yeshua, Jesus, should look like, in a sense that you don't look like the same person anymore. You're not, and I thought it was interesting. That's always stuck with me, but that Paul was different. He was so
Mhm.
different, but he still struggled with things. But it's. I came to actually, I really never liked Paul when I would read some of his letters and some of those verses, and it wasn't until I read a book that someone had written about Paul that I thought, oh my goodness, this man went through so much for his faith. And I think that we don't even really understand how hard it was for him to go from a position of authority that he had to being persecuted by those that he loved and
Mhm.
his own people. He's a great person to learn about in the Bible when you think of, our patriarchs and the people in the New Testament, but it's worth our time to really understand him and who he is and who he was as he was writing his letter. And you even address that in your is God, and I always say this wrong, mis
Is God a misogynist?
misogynist. Why can't I say that? But yeah, misogynist, because that's also, you're kind of putting into perspective the hard things that Paul wrote about.
Mm.
So yeah, he's a tough guy, but he was an intelligent man. I think that's why it was just so difficult to understand sometimes. But you write about
Yeah.
James as well. But you can, if you want to say anything more about Paul, we can keep talking. But I know that you've written about different books of the Bible. You've written on James, and I'd be interested. I don't know much about that one, so if do you want to kind of unpack that one a little bit for us?
The book of James or the
That's
book.
a James.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay. Yeah.
it's my husband and son's favorite book of the Bible. So
Yeah, it's certainly my favorite in the New Testament, probably.
yeah,
I don't know. It's kind of between that and First Peter, actually.
yeah.
I've been really liking First Peter lately. But yeah, I wrote that book back in 2019, I think.
Okay.
Um, and so yeah, it's been a while since I kind of gone through it. But the book that I wrote, it's a commentary,
Mhm.
and it's kind of a commentary slash devotional.
Okay.
And so I go through section by section through the book of James, and so I kind of unpack it verse by verse. And then after that, I sort of have an application section. Like, I have they're essentially articles on that section that of James that we just went through in the commentary, and basically how do I apply it. And
Mhm.
so yeah, James is a really fascinating epistle. Of course, James was the Messiah's brother, right? And he was writing to a Jewish synagogue in chapter 2 of James, when he talks about the assembly, these believers when they're meeting in the assembly.
Mhm.
Let me look at the verse. Yeah, verse 2, James chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in," then he goes on. But that word that is translated as assembly is actually the word synagogue.
Mhm.
And so James is writing to Jewish believers in the Messiah who were meeting in synagogues. And of course, when we read the book of Acts, that we know that that's where the believers met. I mean,
Right.
they were meeting in the Jewish synagogues. James is the same person in Acts 15. In Acts 15, verse 21, he says, Moses is preached in the synagogues every Sabbath.
Right.
And that is in the context of the Jerusalem Council. And basically what he's saying is like these Gentile believers that are coming in, they will hear Moses preached in the synagogue every Sabbath.
Right.
And so that is the context of the earliest Christian movement.
Mhm.
They were believers, both Jews and Gentiles, and initially just Jews at first, but then Gentiles came in, and those Gentiles were essentially joining a Messianic sect of Judaism that met in synagogues every Sabbath, that heard the Torah preached every Sabbath. And so that was the context. And so so the epistle of James is very Jewish in style. It's called, a lot of this is coming back to me now as I'm thinking about it, but it referred to often as New Testament wisdom literature because it's very similar in style to like the Proverbs and
Mhm.
Ecclesiastes. And yeah,
It's
a
pretty
lot of
straightforward.
yeah, it's very straightforward, and he's just giving instruction. He's giving
Mhm.
instruction, very practical instruction to his readers on how to live as followers of the Messiah. Another fascinating aspect of it is that it is essentially James' commentary on Leviticus 19. As
Mm.
you can go through Leviticus 19 and read it side by side with James, and James is drawing from Leviticus 19, like almost verse by verse.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
so it's really fascinating. He's covering a lot of the same topics in Leviticus 19. Also, the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of similarities and
Mhm.
parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and James as well. And so
Mm.
you kind of have this mixture of instruction from the Torah and from the Messiah himself in the book of James. And so yeah, it's a very fascinating work, very straightforward, very practical. One of the reasons I like it a lot
Yeah.
is I like it.
My husband's
Go for
very
it.
black
Yeah.
and white, and so is my son.
Mhm.
My son takes after him, and so that was, like, one of the first books when he became a believer, he started studying because he liked the tone, "Just tell me what to do." I know,
Right.
"Just
Right.
tell me what to do because I don't know what to do." And so he's like he's always told me all my the whole time I've known him, it's like, "James is my go-to." And it's interesting, I was doing some research recently on the order of all the books of the Bible as they were written. So in chronological, not just chronological, but I guess the years they were actually written and we think even in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they were the first four books of the Bible written, but actually James was written first.
Yeah.
It was written somewhere between 40 and 44 AD. So maybe within 10 years after Yeshua resurrected. So
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah.
that was really interesting.
Yeah. Very early. Galatians 2 is very early.
Mhm.
But yeah, yeah, I enjoy it. Another fascinating thing I like about James, and I just anything having to do with the law, the
Mhm.
Torah, I like, of course. But James, he directly commands his readers to keep the Torah. He says in James in chapter 1, verse 22, he says, be doers of the word and not
Mhm.
hearers only, deceiving yourselves. And then he goes on just a couple verses later and he equates the word with the perfect law, the law of liberty. And so that is a direct reference to the Torah. The psalm describes the Torah in similar ways as being perfect and as
Mhm.
bringing freedom. Psalm 119 talks about the Torah in similar ways. And
And
so, yeah,
isn't there a section, I think in James, I want to say either chapter 4, maybe I can't remember, but it says that true religion is taking care of the widows and the
that's
orphan.
chapter 1. Yep.
Oh, it is chapter 1. Okay.
Yep.
So I thought what was so interesting is how much that sounds like Isaiah, I think 53, where
Mhm. Mm.
the Lord is basically criticizing them about their fasting, and he's like, "Go do something. Go take care of people. Take care of and that does come from the law,
Yeah.
and even before Isaiah, obviously, but of taking care of people, taking care of those who are less fortunate, and
Yeah.
women were in that position that when their husbands died or they didn't have a son, they were left like Naomi and Ruth. I mean, that's the
Right.
situation we see playing out in the Bible for us to understand that situation happened. And yeah, so it's very interesting. And my husband helps out a man who does turnover and has rents out places. We live near Kent State, and so there's a lot of people who rent apartments and rent duplexes and whatnot. So they work together, and the one guy owns them. And the reason I'm telling you this is because there was an older woman who was living in one of these apartments, and she was basically hadn't paid her rent for forever. So he had finally had to get a hold of her siblings who were a little younger than her. This one was in her 60s. And I don't know if she was a widow, but she was unmarried, but going in and finding, just like she was unable to take care of herself. She was totally
Mhm.
unable to take care of anything. And so he, as her landlord, literally had to call her family and say, "This woman needs help. This woman," but so often people like that are just, kind of ignored, and
Yeah.
they live this life. But that's what would happen, I guess. A woman in that kind of situation back in the days of Yeshua or before didn't really have a chance to take care of herself unless someone intervened
Yeah.
if she
The
was a widow.
If we take the Torah seriously, we cannot ignore the widow and the orphan.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
some
Torah
part of it.
is very emphatic that
Mhm,
that the widow and the orphan and the stranger that they need to be
mhm,
taken care of. And so that is something that is very much emphasized in the Torah. And yeah, and I think that's why it's also emphasized by the apostles,
mhm,
because they recognize these principles and these
mhm.
teachings.
And and two other things, because you talked about false teaching, of course, and how much that really permeates through Paul's teaching and Peter's teaching and they're all this was a big deal going on because people were already twisting what Messiah had taught, come to teach. And that's pretty much what he said. He came to explain how to keep the law, what it means to us, and even in a sense make it more, what's the word I want to use? Even like even more detailed. Like it's not
Uh,
just enough
yeah.
to not murder, it's about anger and rage and those kind of things. So
Yeah,
um
to bring out its true meaning, its
yeah.
deeper meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess we would say like not just in word and but deed. It's how do you
Mhm.
act? It's spirit and truth. I mean, it's combining all of those things that we can't just Okay, well, I haven't killed anyone. Well, good for you. How many people do you hate?
Right.
How many people have you raged against, or wanted to get back at for one thing or another? I mean, he's bringing those together that they're the same thing. And then also he talks about a warning to teachers. And since that is something I have been doing most of my life, because like very early I had people telling me, "Oh, you're a teacher." And I'm like, "I am," because I really didn't realize that that's what I did. And so, but there's a warning if you're a teacher, and I, that's kind of scary, I guess, and it's something you
Yep.
really need to take seriously.
Yes. Unfortunately, not enough people do.
Right.
That's why the warning is there. And
Mhm.
yeah, but yeah, James is. Yeah, I need to get back into it. It's been a while.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah,
you're
there's
reminding me of how great it is.
yeah. I hear a lot about it, so my husband likes to quote it, so but yeah, it's just even and it's very convicting, and that's why I believe that it was written so early because he had, as a I guess if you call him a bishop, I don't know, but he was the leader over the church in Jerusalem, the synagogue in Jerusalem, and I often use those interchangeably, and I shouldn't, but it was still the assembly, the congregation where they met in Jerusalem, Jew and Gentile, and he was basically telling them how to behave. This
Right?
is how you behave, and we really don't take those things seriously anymore. So, even about our words and our tongue and the damage we can do,
Yeah,
I think
even
that's
keeping our word, right? He
mhm,
talks about let your yes be yes and your no be no. Be
mhm,
be people of integrity. Don't be a flake.
yeah,
but keep your promises, keep your
mhm.
commitments. And speaking of which, sorry I had to cancel last week.
It's
uh,
okay. It
but
happens.
I'm glad we were able to reschedule and do
Mhm.
it this time. But there's that
Something
there's that conviction you talked about from
I know.
James.
It wasn't meant on you, but it just happens. Some things happen. But I did read something this week about sinning, but the sin, it was in, I believe it's back in Numbers, and man, it's a known verse, and now it's just left me. I didn't think about it until just now. But basically the sin that the Lord is talking about is not keeping a promise.
Mm,
It's like that your sin will find you out.
mm.
I think that's the verse it was talking about. Beware that your sin will find you out, or however it's worded. I just can't remember it now. But I thought it was interesting when I read some commentary on that it actually was going back to the fact that these men had made a promise to fight for Israel, and he was warning them that if they didn't keep their promise, their sin would be known. It would find them out. And I think that relates to James in that way, that it was about keeping their promise that they would fight for Israel and they wouldn't forsake them. So
Is it
interesting.
Numbers 32:23? But if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out.
There we go. That's it. And it was all about one of the tribes of Israel. I
Uh-huh.
think it was Gad. They did not want to cross the Jordan. They wanted to camp and make their home and their cities there. And he said, "No, we need you to fight on our behalf here in over the Jordan when we cross the Jordan." So they promised that they would. So I thought that was a great verse, but we often don't take that verse in the context of Numbers and what was happening there.
Right.
We take it as your sin will find you out. Well, yeah, it will, but this was not the same Hebrew word for sin that we often see. It was a different word meaning promise,
Interesting.
or that was the sin. So, yeah. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I
cool.
guess it's a big deal in God's book too that, we make a promise, we make a vow, and we keep it. So,
Yeah. Amen.
mhm. So what else? What else would you like to explain. We only have a few more minutes, but is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention?
I can't think of anything specific. Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to have another conversation sometime.
Yeah. So it was good
Yeah.
to talk with you, and I appreciate you being on.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Cool.
much. So yeah, and I will leave. Are your books on Amazon? Yeah, I think
Yep.
they are, aren't they? Because I
Yep.
did find the reviews on Amazon. So yeah, and I'll leave some show notes. In my show notes, I'll leave stuff about your books and where people can find them if they're interested. And you write for, or you've written, and I think you do some videos for 119 Ministry,
Hmm.
correct?
Yep.
So they're easy to find as well, and I'll leave a link to that. So good
Yeah.
stuff.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, if anyone wants to connect with me, just davidwilber.com. It's Wilber.
ER. I
Yeah.
even have it wrong on my notes. So okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Sure.
it's yeah, that often gets misspelled. I also often get asked, being Messianic, of course, if I'm related to Paul Wilbur,
Yeah.
but I am not, although I have joked before about, wanting to just start telling people that he's my uncle or something.
Yeah.
But,
I, c- I know because I thought I kept telling myself, Stephanie, don't call him Paul. Stephanie, don't call him Paul. Because I get into my head like, oh well, no, no, it's David Wilber. Don't call him Paul. So that's funny. But I'm not surprised that you would be asked that. So well, it's been awesome. Thank you. And I look forward to reading and hearing more about your book. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.